Oops. Thank you. Didn't get this. So I'm on somebody else's computer. I don't know how to move it. Hold on. It doesn't have. Oh, crying out loud. Right, okay, sorry about this. Right, we're just going to start again. So we're going to be doing a revision of feminism. It doesn't work when I'm pressing the things, I'm afraid. Bear with me. Right, we're actually getting there now. Right, I'm doing a revision of feminism today, and this is going to be interactive. So I'm going to be asking some questions on feminism. And we're going to start off by asking you this question. It's not moving for me at all. Oh no. The brake's still not moving.
And you press down, nothing happens, and then you click on the screen. Now it works again.
All right, okay, can I work it now? Yeah. Right, okay, right. What is the purpose of feminism? So this is going to be an interactive discussion. Right, does anybody out there, could I answer the question? What is the purpose of feminism?
Is it to put like an end to sexism, or? Yeah, that's one that comes to my mind. Someone else can, give their.
Can you elaborate a bit more, Samai, in what you mean by that?
So, so we're various in society.
Yes.
You have where male is dominant. So we introducing feminism to eradicate that and have more equal.
Yes.
Equal, yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Samai. Could anybody else like to elaborate? What do they, in their own interpretation, what is the purpose of feminism?
To bring back equality, to look at into the system and society and the roots of patriarchal system.
Yes.
And
Amen.
yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Magda. Anybody else would they like to add to that before we move on? Okay, I'm going to read. Feminism is defined as the belief in the social, political, and economic equality of the sexes. The goal of feminism is to challenge the systemic inequalities women face on a daily basis. Are there any comments on that? If not, we'll move on. We're going to discuss today, we're going to be remembering some important dates today. And I've done a chart there, basically, of all which incur about all the feminist movements throughout the ages. So we're going to start off from 1792 with Mary Wollstonecraft, John Neal, the anti-abolitionist slavery period time in the 1830s, Seneca Falls in New York, the American Civil War, voting for American men in the 1870s, what took place there. We're going to go through women's suffrage, and we're going to go talk about the First World War, voting for women in 1919, and then the 19th Amendment. We're going to talk about Alice Stokes Paul and who she is and what she did. We're going to talk about the 1960s, the reproductive rights that happened there. In 1972, we're going to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment that took place, and also the 1980s. We're not going to go so much into that, but we'll go through, definitely through the others. But that's what we're going to hope to achieve through today's study. Samoi, would you like to read what's on the screen for me, please?
Okay. A revision. Oh, sorry. 1792. Mary Wollstonecraft is best known for a book she wrote, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in which she argues that women are not naturally inferior to men, but appear to be only because they lack education. This suggests that both men and women should be treated as rational beings and imagines a social order founded on reason. She challenged the notion that women exist only to please men and proposed that women and men be given equal opportunities in education, work, and politics. Wollstonecraft's goal was not to undermine the role of women in the home, although at times through vindication it seems she's doing just that, but rather her goal was to encourage society to recognize women as a valuable source.
Lovely, thank you.
Oh,
yeah, go on. Go on, Samoi, sorry, go on.
So in a sense, what I get from it is that this book that she wrote, she's trying to argue that women actually, it's like women should not be put below men. But this probably this is happening because of the lack of education. She also wants women to be treated, equally to men. They also said that in regards to women being, she also said that in regards to women being doing household duties, she's not really undermining that, but although it seems like she's doing it, but she wanted to encourage that woman is actually valuable. Women should not be looked down upon.
Yeah, amen. Well said. Thank you very much for that, Samoi. I would say that this woman also was really before her time. She really was bringing up things that perhaps weren't ready to be moved on, certainly not in her time. I mean, they were thinking about it, but not, she was really before her time, all these things that she was bringing out. But it's the side you could see how God was sort of using women to do these things. So we're just going to go on. If nobody wants to comment about that, we'll move on to the next slide. Sophie, I don't know if you're in a position to read, but I'd love you to read the next slide, please, if you're able. If not, I'll get Magda. Right, Magda, could you read the next slide, please?
Sure. 1823, John Neal, white male, born in 1793, was an American writer, critic, editor, lecturer, and activist. Considered both eccentric and influential, he delivered speeches and publishes essays, novels, poems, and short stories between the 1810s and 1870s in the United States and Great Britain. Neal advanced the development of American art, fought for women's rights, advocated the end of slavery and racial prejudice. As one of the first men to advocate women's rights in the US and the first American lecturer on the issue, for over 50 years he supported female writers and organizers, affirmed intellectual equality between men and women, fought coverture laws against women's economic rights, and demanded suffrage, equal pay, and better education for women. His Rights of Women speech in 1843, at the peak of his influence as a feminist, had a considerable impact on the future of the movement.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, so he was activist, he was writer, and all that. So he was known especially in the United States and Great Britain. And advanced the development of American art, but especially fought for women's rights and to end the slavery and racial prejudice. And we know that these two goes hand in hand. It was the first man who advocates for women's rights in America. He did do lectures on that issues, supported female writers. He fought for the intellectual equality, coverture laws against women's economic rights, and for equal pay, the suffrages, and education for women.
Okay, thank you. It's quite interesting when I read this as well, because when we think of feminism, we just automatically think of women. And so when I saw this, I thought, oh, wow. So for me, I can see that God was using males as well as females in pushing this movement forward. So here we have a feminist, a male feminist, who is speaking up for women's rights. But the thing is, he's not speaking about it, he's actually doing something about it. And so for me, I know that God is not just using women to do this, he wants men to work alongside it. And we're going to see the sort of things that this gentleman did, and the influence that he had, and hopefully the impact that he had on men's thinking. So on that, we're going to go to the next slide. Emma, could you read the next one for me, please? Emma, are you there? Right, I'm not really sure who's there.
Yes, do you want to read that?
You are there. Oh, sorry. There
You
you are.
want me to read that, Debbie?
Pardon? Yeah, you seem to be going in and out. I can't hear you, Emma. In fact, I can't hear you at all. Right, would anybody else like to read? I think Emma's having some problems with her.
Sorry, we can't. I think.
Oh, I can. Right, she's sort of coming and going. We still can't hear you, Emma.
I'm here now.
Oh, right, that's it. Okay, sorry. You go ahead then, please.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, clearly.
Is it our network? Yeah, it came up. It goes about section. We're here.
Are you reading, Emma? Because I can't still hear
Sorry,
you.
yeah, I think it is our internet. I'm not sure. I'll try lecture. Oh, you can't hear me. Great.
Oh, I can hear you now.
You can hear Natalie.
Yes, I can hear you now. Yeah, and that's yes.
Okay, Neil delivered America's first women's rights lecture as an Independence Day address in Portland.
Yeah, you're definitely having problems with your internet there.
In 1832, he declared that under coverture and without suffrage, women were victims of New York City.
Can't hear you.
Okay, do you want to get someone else?
Yes, I will do. Can somebody else read for us, please? Is Curtis there?
Hi, Debbie. Yeah.
Hi there, please. Thank you.
Neil delivered America's first women's rights lecture as an Independence Day address in Portland, Maine in 1832. He declared that under coverture and without suffrage, women were victims of the same crime of taxation without representation that caused the Revolutionary War. He reached the peak of his influence on feminist issues at the time of his Rights of Women speech in 1843, before a crowd of 3,000 people in New York City. He attacked the concept of virtual representation in government that suffrage opponents argued women could enjoy through men. Just reverse the condition of the two sexes. Give to women all the power now enjoyed by men. What a clamor there would be then about equal rights, about a privileged class, about being taxed without their own consent, and virtual representation and all that.
Right. Right. Can you get an understanding of that passage, please?
I think it's just alluding to the fact this guy, Neil, gave a speech talking about how he likened how women were being taxed to the Revolutionary War. And obviously Americans held that strongly as when they fought in the Revolutionary War against the British. And so he hoped that, please could you go back to the last slide? He hoped that...
Oh, sorry. I didn't even realize I did that, you know. Oh, I can't even turn it now.
Oh, no. It's okay.
Oh,
He hoped that
sorry.
they would be able to resonate with that comparison and see just how bad it affected women in society at that time. And so he then again attacked this concept of what he calls virtual representation, where women would have to go through men to get representation in government, and they couldn't be represented by themselves in that said government, and then reverse the role, or proposed a reverse of that and said, how would you feel if the same happened to men? You would obviously find it abhorrent, and so appealed to their conscience by comparing and contrasting the situations that women found themselves in with different situations that hopefully the men in the chamber would understand or resonate with.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to thank you very much for that, Curtis. Thank you.
Debs, just before we
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to look up what that virtual representation meant. So I'll just quickly look in there as Curtis was kind of recapping on what it meant. And basically it was, I'm just reading a little excerpt from Google, and it says, by definition, virtual representation is the political concept that elected members of a representative body do not represent individuals or a geographic region, but represent the entire country or empire. And basically, in a nutshell, it's basically saying that, you know, oh, it's okay that women aren't in power because men are in power, and men represent the whole nation, the whole country, so the needs of the individuals will like automatically be covered. So I thought it was interesting that he's understanding that that's just not the case. That's just not how it works. Like, men can be in power, and we've seen it with all the women's rights issue. They don't think about the laws and the impacts of women, for example, in this case. So yeah, it's just in case, I was just sharing that just in case anyone else was wondering what what that political concept is.
That's
just
wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was really lovely, Sophie. Thank you very much. Oh, I've done that. We might get you to do the next
To
one.
read the next one.
Yes. That's if I can get it on what I'm. Oh, God. It's all right when you're on somebody else's computer.
Yep,
Right,
I know the
Sophie.
feeling. I know the feeling, don't worry.
Yes, thank you. If you can read that one for
Um,
me, I'd be grateful. Thank you, Sophie.
Yep. The rights of women's speech was widely covered, albeit dismissed by the press, and Neil printed it later that year in the pages of Brother Jonathan magazine, of which he was editor. He used that magazine in 1843 to publish his own essays, calling for equal pay and better workplace conditions for women, and to host a printed debate of correspondence on the merits of women's suffrage between himself and Eliza W. Farnham. Looking back more than 40 years later, the second volume of the History of Women's Suffrage, 1887, remembered that the lecture roused considerable discussion, was intensively copied, and had a wide, silent influence, preparing the way for action. It was a scathing satire, and men felt the rebuke.
Oh, right.
Mm.
Would you like to elaborate on that one?
Yeah, I think what I'm getting from this, Debs, is that the mainstream press was not interested in the radical approach that he had at that time, which Curtis read, that, you know, women, it's just that women need to be represented, and if it was reversed, if the roles were reversed, men would be up in uproar if women had all the power. So then what he does is he publishes it independently, in a magazine that he's the editor of, and talks about things that he's talking about: equal pay, better workplace conditions, and it sparked lots of debate, to the point that 40 years later, it's still, you know, having a lot of impact in this. I imagine what is a pivotal book called The History of Women's Suffrage, and it had a wide silent influence that eventually kind of prepared the way for action. And what I thought was particularly powerful is that men are feeling the rebuke, so they're recognizing that they've done something, you know, that they're in the wrong here. So I think what maybe we can take or maybe what I can see from it rather, is that mainstream press, that particular form of media, of information, just wasn't interested in publishing this very radical thought of feminism. So then he goes and he independently publishes it, and that does the work eventually to kind of pave the way for equality.
Yeah, lovely. I think God used it, just shows me as well that it wasn't a woman this time again who had to bring this out. It was good that God used a male to do this. And the fact that his influence did rebuke it, because I think that was overall what God wanted to do. He wants them to realize that their patriarchy is not something that he's given them, or they feel that they have the privilege of having, you know. So God has to use males as well as women, but even more powerful from males, I think, to rebuke males. And it was good. I think that this, for me, was very powerful. I like the fact that they felt it. So it did its work. The fact that he was this strong influence, it actually did its work on males. So thank you for that.
Absolutely, Debs. And you
Yeah.
know what it reminded me of as well? It reminded me of, you see, it's not a like for like, but you see the women that went to the press about all the sexual abuse and discrimination they were facing in Hollywood, like the Harvey Weinstein, like they went to press, and the press had no interest in publishing their stories about the inequality and what was happening. And then the women went to social media with the Me Too movement, and all of a sudden, you know, it took a while, but then it really kind of had this same impact. Like it really paved the way for a lot of what we're seeing, of women kind of protesting for their rights, going online and talking about what the reality is. And I think the result, if we look at the Harvey Weinstein thing, and it's some of the ones in the UK, like when Sarah Everard was murdered, a lot of young men came online, and I think they felt the rebuke, and I think they realized that, okay, we don't have this, we can just walk home, we don't have to worry about, you know, being raped and all of these sort of things. So I kind of see it as, although this is talking about a different history, I still think that the same God is still working in this same way that you mentioned.
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you. I was going to go on to the next one. Right, oops. Was it 13? Yeah. Right, we're just going to go on to the next one. Right, I don't know if Emma's internet is working. I'd love you to read something for us, Emma, or Natalie, please, if you can.
See, I think it's a bit better. Can you hear me?
That's clearer. It was clearer before, but it just kept going in and out, Emma.
I know, I'm hoping it hasn't cut for the last slide, so hopefully it hasn't.
No, that sounds brilliant. Yes, thank you.
1830. The dominant social reform issue of the 1830s was slavery. Frederick Douglass was a formerly enslaved man who became an important activist, author, and public speaker. He became a leader in the abolitionist movement, which sought to end the practice of slavery before and during the Civil War. After that conflict and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1862, he continued to push for equality and human rights for both men and women, and supported the women's suffrage movement. There were women activists supporting the abolition of slavery at that time. What effect did it have on them in how they saw their own constraints with regard to gender, and what became the result of this?
Would you like to elaborate on that?
So this is just talking about Frederick Douglass, who was a slave himself and had become freed, or I don't know how he got freed or whether he escaped, but
he escaped.
He escaped. He became an activist and author and leading in the abolitionist movement to abolish slavery. And he carried on that work for his whole life, I think. And he pushed for human rights for everybody, and he stood up for women's rights as well, his suffrage movement. And that last question, I don't know if you're going to go on to answer that in the next slide, so I won't.
Yes, I will do. Yeah, so if you remember that question, I want to get you to read the next slide, if that's okay. Right, okay.
1848, Women's Convention was held at Seneca Falls, New York. That was the first one, I think. What was addressed at that meeting, and what was the meeting for? It was to discuss women's rights, and it was to get their voice heard, basically. And it was started by two women who had gone to a anti-slavery convention in London and were told that they couldn't have a voice there, had to sit up in the balcony and not speak. And they were incensed by this and recognized that they don't have a voice as women, and they came back to try and find out how they could get a voice.
Okay.
He was at that meeting. There were men at that meeting, and he spoke out for them to fight for women's rights for voting, actually. Because they were debating about whether they should get a vote or not, because it would cause too much political upheaval. They just wanted to get rights on smaller issues before pushing for the vote. Some didn't want to push for the vote, but he said, basically, if half the population are not represented if women don't get the vote, and basically said, if black people have it, as a black man, I don't want it if women can't have it, basically.
Yeah, I think he wanted them to be subordinate to it as well. I think that's something that we can go into afterwards. Yeah, yeah, okay. So the next one, Declaration of Sentiments.
What was this document? What were they hoping to achieve, and what was it based upon? Not sure.
You did a study on that, Emma.
Did I?
Yeah.
Declaration of Sentiments.
You did, yeah.
I think that was a list of the rights that they were calling for, and they wanted to be recognised in the home. I can't actually remember what they wanted. I just know that they came out of that saying they do want to fight for the vote.
Yeah.
They wanted a right to education as well, I think.
Yeah, there was a lot. I mean, it was a whole list of things which were, and they based it upon the Declaration of Independence. That's how they wrote up the document. It was actually based upon that document. And so that's how they were calling, if you're putting this in the Constitution, this is what we're demanding, that sort of thing. That's what came out of the sentiments, and it was definitely patterned on that US Declaration of Independence. Right, okay, and that's it. I think we'll go to the next one. Do you want to?
This is the beginning of first wave feminism. How can we compare this to the 1960s?
So what took place in the 1960s?
Civil rights movement with Martin Luther King.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So how can we, do you want to elaborate on that?
And a similar kind of pattern of how it starts with black rights, and
Yes,
as it did with slavery in this history, abolition, and out of that came women's rights.
exactly.
And towards the end of the 1960s, women's rights came to the forefront.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. Thank you, dear. Go to the next one. Is Natalie there?
She don't want to speak.
Oh, she doesn't want to speak. Oh dear. Okay. I don't know who else is out there. Magda, would you like to read this? So I'm not really sure who else is out there. Or Samoy, would you like to read this one?
Yeah, I won't know how to answer that question, but yeah, I can read the question.
Yeah, you're right. Okay. Do you remember the Seneca document? You can actually bring it up if you like on your phone. You can, and it'll show you what sort of things they demanded.
Where would I find that document?
If you just put Seneca Falls Convention, if you just tap Seneca Falls Convention, it should come up with some reforms on there.
Oh, in Google?
Yeah.
So the question is, what were the reforms demanded at Seneca Falls?
Yeah, so this happened at 1848, and this is where women had this convention. So what sort of things were they discussing? What sort of things were important to them that they wanted to bring out of this meeting that was important? I'll give you a clue.
It says here that the Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention. It advertised itself as a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women.
Yes, okay. Okay, so one of them was married women's property laws. So what was happening with regards to that?
I'm not seeing that, sorry.
Right, okay. What I'll do then, I'll bring that out. So
Yeah.
basically at women's property laws, what they were bringing out, what was happening at that time was they wanted to, the married women's property laws, which would protect married women from drunk and dissolute husbands, these type of husbands that were squandering money on the property that they brought into marriage. And they wanted also a loosening of divorce restrictions that were there as well. So that's going to come up. So they wanted divorce restrictions to be loosened a little bit more, and that's mostly because women at that time weren't able to get a divorce, even if the husband left them. Okay. Also, women didn't have any civil rights in the fact that they couldn't get the divorce, and they couldn't, and if they were divorced, they couldn't recover those rights. So the fact that they were having this meeting was seen really as quite radical at that time, and not everybody agreed to some of the things that they were bringing out. So that's basically what this meeting was about. So I'm just going to go back onto this one now. You want to read this one, Samoy, please?
Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were the leading female abolitionists,
Yeah.
abolitionists who organized the convention. So is this the same Seneca Convention?
Yes, it is. Yeah. So it's those two women in particular that organized it.
Okay. So what was the reason for the convention? There was contention at the meeting. Why and what was this about?
Remember, do you know anything about the declaration of sentiments that they made and when they had the meeting? What was the reason they had the meeting? Why did they have it? What was discussed?
Is it the same thing that you just said? That
yeah, well, it was because they were having a ballot for women. This is something else now. I want to bring out some other things that they were talking about.
That I'm gonna be honest, like Seneca Falls thingy, I'm not so acquainted with.
Okay, we're going to go on to the next slide. Right, okay. Basically, they had this meeting both women had this meeting, and they they wanted to have women's votes, right? And I think at the time there was half of women were for it, and the other half weren't. So the contention that caused at the meeting was that, and the reason why they didn't want to have it was because they didn't think it would be pushed forward, and the other half accepted it because of something else that took place at the Civil War, and we will go into that in the next slide. So, and even one of the husbands, I think it was, go on, sorry.
Debbie, sorry, they didn't have it primarily to get the vote. That came up
Yeah.
to discuss civil and religious rights of women,
Yes.
because they've been denied speaking at that conference they went to. And so it sparked them to think, look, we haven't got rights on all these fronts. And it was, they just had all their rights taken away once they got married. You know, if they had any property or money, it all went to the husband. If they got divorced, everything went to the husband, the children, the custody, everything was in the rights of the husband. They didn't have any say what happened to any of that. And then they didn't have opportunity to go to college. It was all for men. There was no education for women. And they were saying, we want equal access to all these things.
Right, so that's what the convention was about. Thank you
But
very
then
much.
they were split over the vote, like you say, it came up and
they were. Yeah, they were split over the vote, weren't they? And it really got well, drastic results that came from that, especially the women who came against it, and we'll go into more discussions about that later on. Right, okay, go back into that. So right, okay. Would you like to read the next one, Emma?
(1861–65), turning our attention now to the Civil War. On the previous slide, we discussed that women were fighting for suffrage rights, voting rights. So 13 years have now passed since the convention. What took place in 1865, and what was achieved, and for whom? During the Civil War, women had played roles that they rarely had opportunities to participate in before the war. For example, nurses behind the battlefield were taking over and running the farms, with their husbands and fathers and sons now off at war. Sounds like World War II.
Yeah. So that question before, what happened in 1865? Obviously, they were fighting for their rights, their voting rights. So what actually took place on 1865? I'm trying to bring the discussion why they had that contention. So what was that contention? What was it about? And what took place in 1865? That's what I want to bring out there.
I'm not sure, unless it's slavery, to do with slavery, but I'm not sure about women's rights in 1865.
Right, okay. In 1865, they were fighting for rights. So what actually took place in 1865? Rights were given, but who was it given to?
Black men.
Exactly. So that's the point I'm trying to bring out in 1865. Even though they had been fighting for rights, what actually took place in 1865, it was the rights that was actually given to who? African-American men.
Men.
Yeah. Yes. Do you want to elaborate a bit more on that, Emma? Sure, understood that.
No, just that with the emancipation of slaves, the men were given rights to vote, but the black women weren't, and none of the white women. Obviously, it wasn't about women; it was about liberating black slaves.
Right. Okay. And it was
the women didn't get a look in. That's how I understand it.
Yes. Okay. Then next one. Right. The Civil War marked a turning point for women and their role in society. So before the Civil War, work for most women was in the home. Women were expected to cook and clean to make the home comfortable for the family and presentable for guests. With the outbreak of the Civil War, however, many women volunteered to help in the war effort. They worked in a variety of capacities, from cooking to nursing to actually fighting on the front lines. Magda, would you like to read the next one, please?
In 1861, at the urging of women activists, the government created the U.S. Sanitary Commission to supply Union troops with food, medicine, and supplies, such as blankets and socks. While officials of the commission were men, women were the backbone of the group and worked directly with and on behalf of the soldiers. They collected and distributed the supplies for the Union troops. Women on the front lines. For some women, working as nurses was not enough. As many as 400 women disguised themselves as men to enlist and fight for both the Union and Confederacy, risking imprisonment if they were caught. Women fought for many of the same reasons as men did, out of sense of patriotism, to help eradicate slavery, to earn money, and to escape difficult or unsatisfying home life. Because the women were disguised as men, they performed the same tasks as men. They served on the front line, cooked, acted as spies, nursed the wounded.
Amen. Thank you very much, Magda. So that's quite explanatory. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment about that. Magda, would you like to read the next one, please?
It was not that difficult for a woman to pose as a man, especially since they were serving alongside many teenage boys. The age to enlist in the Union Army was 18, and there was no minimum age for the Confederate Army. On the Union side, many younger boys lied about their age so they could join the army. The women soldiers bound their breasts, cut their hair short, and spoke as little as possible to avoid being discovered. Women would often leave the service if they were wounded or became sick for fear of being caught. Those experiences had led many to rethink the exclusion of women from the political sphere, which was something that would happen again more decisively during World War I.
Thank you, Magda. Does anybody want to make a comment on that? If not, we'll go on to the next slide. Right, would anybody like to answer the question? So when the 15th Amendment was proposed, supporting African-American men and not women, how did that make the suffragists feel? So that movement that we just read that happened in 1848, when they found out that they were fighting for suffrage, for voting rights, and that it was actually given to African-American men and not to them, what happened? This is the contention that caused them to have this division, this split within this movement. So how did it make that half of the movement feel? Would anybody like to, does anybody remember? Emma, do you remember this?
Not specifically. I just I'm assuming they were upset.
Yeah, I think
Motivated them to campaign further.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So they were campaigning all that time, and all of a sudden, men got the vote after 13 years afterwards. Basically, they felt very angered, and I should imagine they felt very resentful. But it's not the fact that they just felt, these things. They actually put that anger and resentment into action. So far as to oppose, they try to oppose or stop this movement from going ahead from somehow. They wanted to, so much so that they joined. It got them to, they really started thinking drastically about things. And it was, I can't remember, it's the two women that did it. Yeah, what they did was they actually went into alliance with the Democrats, and the Democrats at that time were racists, but they still wanted to work hand in hand with them to stop the amendment going through. So this is what they chose to do, because this is how resentful they were, and they even sort of made some racist remarks, as if to say, these degraded men, why should they be given the votes more than we did? So that other half, that split, that really harsh sort of contention, made them think drastically and act drastically at that time. So note not all women were angry and resentful, but accepted the amendment. But like I just reiterated, the other half of the movement saw it differently, which caused them to think drastically. So here we see there was a split within the women's suffrage. And basically it was because of the Fifth Amendment that was ratified for African-American men. We just spoke about that. They actually made alliances with the Democrats, who at that stage were and they did this in 1867, and they were actually racists. And you think to yourself, gosh, these women were abolitionists for slavery, and now they're alliancing themselves with these racist Democrats simply because this Fifth Amendment was ratified. So this is what took place.
Debs, I was just going to say,
Yeah,
it's interesting. I keep seeing as you're kind of going through your study, so many parallels. The first one and the one that Emma brought out, like that it parallels the Second World War. And as I was thinking about this, I don't know if anyone's been following what's been happening within radical feminism as a movement, that there is a split, and it's over transgender women, and basically one half of radical feminism, they're called TERFs, which stands for trans exclusionary radical feminists. So they don't believe that transgender women should be included, and they have done exactly the same pattern. They're basically aligning themselves in the UK with the Conservative Party, in America with Republicans. They keep aligning with far-right ideologies, not recognizing that they are just like you're basically siding with the side that promoted slavery, thinking that they're going to advocate for your rights. And I just see such a parallel with that, in they're not understanding that trans women are women. They suffer the same gender inequality, the same sexism, the same discrimination. So my mind just went to that wow, it's like, again, that same history is being repeated.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you very much for that. We're just going to go into 18. We're going to move on to the next one, which is 1870. So how did the 19th Amendment come about after women's suffrage failed in 1870? So we know that it failed because the 15th Amendment came out, and they voted for rights for men, African-American men. So does anybody, would they like to sort of answer that question? So what sort of had to take place, basically, is the question. For them to push forward their agenda, what needed to take place, and perhaps what they didn't really understand at the time. Does anybody understand the questions, or would they like to elaborate? How could women get Congress to support women's suffrage? If not, we'll move on. So this is the first thing that needed to take place. Magda, would you like to read this one, please?
First, legislators have a motivation not to expand the scope of the political community that elected them to office. If an all-male electorate put you in office, why take a chance on empowering women who may or may not vote the same way as men?
Okay, thank you. So what needed to take place really wasn't just they needed to, because obviously they were moving it to political, in the political sphere now. So what needed to take place was that we found out when I was reading that they had to have, the states had to be the one to sort of push it forward, to sort of bring it into Congress. So it was the states that had to accept it first. And I think this is where the contention was, because not many states weren't accepting it, hence why it wasn't pushed forward. So this is why we have the first thing they needed to do was to get this, and the second thing was the second obstacle that was preventing them from pushing their agenda forward was to expand the political community. Has to do with the political community itself, so the states itself, rather than its representatives, Congress. And this even was more challenging. So this was even more challenging. Why would existing voters choose to share their power with others, particularly if those newcomers might systematically, when it says newcomers, women, differ from them on particular political issues? So it's always, when I look at this and the political situation, it's always what's in it for them. You know, if it's not going to benefit them, you know, why should we have these people on board? So I don't know if anybody sees anything like that or sees it like that. And I'd like to elaborate more on that. If not, we'll move on to the next slide.
It just seems that people always want to hold on to their power, and that fear is a huge driving motivation, that if these people get too strong, we'll lose our position.
Yes, yeah. So it's fear was a good factor about it, yeah. And again, they couldn't see that it benefiting them. So as much as you know, we look at the political view of things, it really was a stumbling block with regards to this movement. It's almost like, gosh, we can't seem to move forward anymore, you know. But anyway, they do get it forward, so we'll go on.
Which is it's miraculous, really, because it's going to take some men. The men are all the ones in power. It's going to take some men to be on their side to pass anything through anyway.
Of course.
There had to be a certain number of men who were supportive of the whole thing.
Of course, and this is how God had to do it. He had to. It wasn't just, you know, moving on women's hearts. He had to move on men's hearts as well, because it did affect them. It affects them.
Yeah.
So why did men tend to reject women's suffrage, especially in the South? Think about what the gender laws were at the time, at that dispensation. So why do you think that in the South that women's suffrage was rejected? Does anybody have any thoughts?
Giving other people opportunity.
Yeah. Go on, Emma, you speak up.
Unmute as I said that. Because if they are inherently racist, they're not going to, if they're not passing the test of racism, as we would put it, they're not going to pass the test of sexism. So they see people as property. They have a right to own property. They see women the same way. Women don't have any voice, don't have any rights in that history. What is that? And so they're not going to accept it.
No, okay. Yes.
I'm assuming.
Yeah, and also they were, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, I was comparing, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay, we'll go on to the next one then. So we're just going to look at an example of why African American men were given the vote, and how the political party used that to their advantage, and to give them the vote. So after the Civil War, it was the Republicans who empowered African American men. They in turn voted for Republicans. How did this happen? Republicans had temporary control of the government after the Civil War. And that was the reason why this expansion took place, because they had an alliance supporting it. The Northern Democrats were not in a strong position at that time during the Civil War. Does everybody understand that? Samoy, would you like to read the next one for me, please? Samoy, are you there?
Sorry, Debbie. I'm kind of having a little bit of pain. Can move on to Uma now? Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't hear what she said then. Right.
Yeah, I think she can't just read at the moment, Deb.
Oh, right.
So
do you want to? Yes, please. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
The reason for the expansion of women's suffrage is ideological, and when we look at history, we find this has been connected to a war. When a deprived group of people begin to contribute to a war effort, i.e. African American men, people often start thinking differently. This is what took place for the African American men during the Civil War, which led to the ratification of the 15th Amendment. When we look at the women's suffrage, this is very similar to what took place with when in World War I, which led to the ratification of the 19th Amendment. We can therefore see from above, looking at the political parties, the difficulty securing women's suffrage was they didn't see any reason for women to lean to one side or the other, which means neither political party had any obvious incentive to support, empowering of women.
Do you want to comment on that at all, or was that just self-explanatory?
Yeah, I think it's self-explanatory. I think what
Yeah.
it's bringing out here is that before, these people in the first history, African American, they're not even seen as having any sort of contribution to society, not worth anything, not even worth giving them rights, let alone fighting for their rights. But suddenly when you see them on the front lines, there's always this during wartime, everyone's equal, because it's everyone's life that's on the line. So suddenly you see, your brother or your sister fighting for your nation, for your survival, for your life. And I think it sparks something that you start to see them as worthy of rights, worthy of fighting for their rights. And I think it's saying the same thing happened during the world wars with women.
Yes.
That, before you don't see them as, worth having rights, let alone fighting for their rights. And then suddenly you see that, they're healing the sick, they're on the front lines, risking their lives in the trenches to kind of nurse up and provide medical care. I think it was in the Second World War, they even actively, drove army tanks, there were decoders, kind of doing really important code breaking work that kind of, I think the stats show that it brought the end to the war a lot faster. And then suddenly you realize that thing that in a war we're all equal, and actually these people that you've been looking down, actually they're human too. And all of a sudden I think the viewpoint slightly changes to the point that you start to think, actually I want to fight for their rights and I want to give them rights.
Yes, amen. Thank you very much, Sophie. Amen. Oops, is it moving again? I think I wanted that back actually. Oops. Right, okay. There was definitely a larger gender gap within politics than compared to today. Men were the more dominant classes at that time and were not going to empower women if it did not in some way benefit them. They were certainly not going to hand over their power to women. This would be difficult to overcome.
I think, Debbie, what I was seeing from that last one, and,
yes. Oh, sorry.
Sophie said at the end that people about seeing people as equal and wanting to give them rights. I'm not sure it was that kind of unselfish from what you were saying about the politics, that there's no incentive for them to give rights to these people if they're not going to vote for them. So if they could, it would swell their political affiliation. If people would support them and vote for them, then they're going to give them the vote because they're going to get more people on their side.
Yeah, they had the wrong motives.
Exactly. To me, it seems more that motivation. I'm not saying some people weren't genuinely, for equality and on the side of blacks or women, but it seems to me that it was very politically motivated, that it depends who's going to vote for who, whether we give you the rights or not. And if we think we're going to swell our side, we'll give you the right. Or the noise gets so loud they can't ignore it anymore. It's like it's just at that kind of revolution stage where they're saying, okay, we have to do something. But which is kind of like the Civil War. It forced their hand. And we know with the Civil War, with slavery, if we used compare and contrast, we know that people passed those laws motivated from selfish interest, that most people were still racist at heart, even in the North. So it wasn't, and it never got rid of it, with segregation and separate but equal and all those sentiments we've learned about racism. We know it's never really been dealt with, and it's still in people's hearts, and it's the same with sexism.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Anna. Definitely. So thank you. So what changed over time in the political agenda to support the empowerment of women? Would anybody like to answer that question? So what changed over time in the political agenda to support the empowerment of women? So what was it? So in 1870, different parts of the USA, especially the West, these states actually supported women's suffrage. They agreed that women should have equal pay, become justices of the peace, and also teachers. So it's actually moving here. So some states, were for it, and some states weren't. In 1890 and 1896, the Western states were the first to ratify women's suffrage. But in some of the western coasts of the states, these states were still rejecting women's suffrage, although by closer margins that in the east side of the United States. And in 1896, women's suffrage was rejected by 55% to 45% in California. Between 1896 and 1910, no other state adopted women's suffrage. So this is leading up right up to 1910. Remember, they started this from 1848. So this was like a real hurdle, real uphill struggle. That was a period in which, Debray, would you like to...
Sorry, before you move on, were you going to give the reasons why Utah and Wyoming supported women's suffrage?
Why they were supporting women's suffrage?
Because it's quite interesting if you look into
I think it was because they, in that time, I think these particular states, what did I read? They were on the front line somewhere. I think it's to do with the Civil War. They were, like the part that we read before, they were doing things. I think there was jobs up for grabs, and it was like male jobs, and they were given to the women because they could do them. And so that's how they was. I think that's what I remember.
Well, I'm just googling it now. I mean, this is just the first.
Yeah, and that's the reason why. Yeah,
this gives different. Well, it gives different reasons, and they're both motivated by selfishness. So Utah is a Mormon state.
Oh right, yes, it is. Yeah,
and they are wanting to They wanted to be granted statehood. They weren't an official state. So by granting women the vote, they hoped to dispel the idea that Mormon society oppressed women, and they saw this as an opportunity to enlist the help of the Eastern suffrage organizations.
So it was like you said, selfish reasons.
Yeah, and Wyoming was different. Wyoming, the men were motivated by sheer loneliness. In 1869, the territory had over 6,000 males and only 1,000 females, and the area hoped that women would be more likely to settle in that rugged country if they granted them the vote.
Oh gosh, so it wasn't to do with more.
So it's not.
I know that I read somewhere. I did read somewhere that there were some jobs that they knew the women could do, and so this was how they and that's why the reason why. I don't know if it's like you just said. It could be something like that, but they gave them the jobs and they wanted this equal pay for them. I don't think I looked deeper into why they did it, but I know that's one of the reasons why they did it. Yeah, so that was helpful. Thank you very much, Emma. So at that time, women's suffrage had little support in the south of the US, mostly because of their conservative way of life. So they're very sort of traditional in their thinking. So women in the south were more likely to have larger families. They were more likely to be less educated and not live in cities, preferring to live on farms. So what explains the dramatic shift from 4 states enacting women's suffrage by 1910 and 30 states having adopted it by 1920, when the federal constitutional amendment finally passed? We're just going to answer that now. We know that women became better educated. I mean, I know that Emma did a study on this. So, and she brought this out. She said that we knew that women became better educated because of the opportunities that were there, that were given to them. And we know that 1/3 of the college graduates in the 1900s were women. So women were offered more opportunities in the cities. They were having smaller families, no longer having these larger families anymore. We spoke about, especially in Tess's presentations, that, washing machines and all these gadgets were sort of making women's lives easier in the home. So what does that mean? When they've got these gadgets, they were doing things a lot quicker. Therefore, it was giving them much more time for them to attend these reform movements. So, and then she spoke about progressivism. Progressivism was ultimately the first as women's movements were becoming stronger, with the passing of laws pushed that hurdle further, especially between the time of 1910 and 1915. And of course, the second was World War I. So that was progressivism.
To add to that, Debbie,
yes, sure, yeah.
It was more the previous one, but it was also motivated by racism, because Wyoming wanted to have more white settlers, and they figured that if they get white women out there, white men would be more likely to settle down there, and they would produce more white children, etc., etc. So
there's a racist thing behind it as well.
So you know that if they're still at heart racist, they're never really going to be.
Yeah.
They're going to leave sexism behind either.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you. Right, I'll go back to this one. Right, we're going to look at the 1920 waymark that we put on the chart. So passing of the 19th Amendment of the Constitution was passed in 1919 by Congress, which was ratified in 1920. So there we are. So this so they had to wait for some couple of decades here. So the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment legally guarantees American women the right to vote. Achieving this milestone required a lengthy and difficult struggle. Victory took decades of distress and protest, ending almost a century of protest. So what took place after this? The number of working women increased by 25% as a result of the work that they had undertaken during World War I. So the roles of women in the 1920s in the workplace included factory workers, secretaries, sales clerks, telephone operators. And this is a bit I got from Wikipedia. So women were excluded from voting in ancient Greece and Republican Rome, as well as in the few democracies that emerged in Europe by the end of the 18th century. When the franchise was widened, and it was in the United Kingdom in 1832, women continued to be denied all voting rights. The question of women's voting rights finally became an issue in the 19th century, and the struggle was particularly intense in Great Britain and the United States. But those countries were not the first to be granted right to vote, at least not on a national basis. By the early years of the 20th century, women had won the right to vote in national elections in New Zealand in 1893, in Australia in 1902, in Finland in 1906, and Norway in 1913. In Sweden and the United States, they had voting rights in some local elections. So that was interesting. In as early as 1993, New Zealand was granted the vote for women there. So we're going to speak about Alice Stokes and who she was. And she's very sort of, we're going to read the reason why. So she sort of she actually was an American Quaker, and she was a women's rights activist in 1923. And she was one of the main leaders and strategists. So she was a policymaker of the campaign for the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. So she actually wrote some writing towards this 19th Amendment, which prohibits sex discrimination in the right to vote. So Alice Paul initiated, and along with Lucy Burns and others, strategized events such as the Women's Suffrage Procession and the Silent Sentinels, which were part of the successful campaign that resulted in the amendment's passage in 1920. Alice Stokes Paul was an American Quaker, suffragist, feminist, and women's rights activist, and one of the main leaders and strategists of the campaign for the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, which prohibits sex discrimination in the right to vote. She wrote the first version of the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced in that year. So a woman wrote that version for the ERA. This goes on to talk about how, because she was an activist, how she was brutally and physically abused by the police. And also, I think they actually put her in jail as well, I think. So she spent half a century as leader of the National Women's Party. She fought for the Equal Rights Amendment and to secure constitutional equality for women. So she won a large degree of success with the inclusion of women as a group protected against discrimination by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Okay. So on March 27, 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment is passed by the US Senate and sent to the states for ratification. The first proposed by the National Women's Political Party in 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment was to provide for the legal equality of the sexes and prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. More than 4 decades later, the revival of feminism in the 1960s spurred its introduction into Congress under the leadership of the US Representative Bella Abzug of New York and the feminists, and it won the requisite 2/3 vote for the US House of Representatives in October 1971. So in March of 1972, it was approved by the US Senate and sent to the states. But look how long all these things took. I mean, we're not talking months or years, we're talking decades here. So in summary, what we looked at today, we looked at all these dates that you see on the screen, and that covered the first wave feminism and second wave feminism and all these dates, which were important dates for us to remember. So we're just coming to the end of it now. And so what is at the center of all the irritation women have to face? Male domination, called patriarchy. What is patriarchy? It is simply an obsession with male control. Emma, would you like to read the rest of this for me, please? Just got to be on the end of this now.
A characteristic of patriarchy is an obsession with control as a core value around which social life is organized. As with any system of privilege that elevates one group by oppressing another, control is an essential element of patriarchy. Men maintain their privilege by controlling women and anyone else who might threaten it. Men are assumed and expected to be in control at all times, to be unemotional except for anger or rage, to present themselves as invulnerable, autonomous.
Hello?
Independent, strong, rational of every situation, especially those involving women. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Sorry, you went off for a moment then, sorry.
These qualities, it is assumed, mark them as superior and justify their privilege. Women, in contrast, are assumed and expected to be just the opposite, especially in relation to men. Patriarch is male-identified and male-centered.
Thank you. Does anybody want to comment on that? If not, we'll move on. Sophie, would you like to read the next one for me, please?
Yeah. Patriarchy is like a fire burning deep.
Yeah, sorry, I missed the E out.
Oh, the first one. Okay, yeah. It's like a fire burning deep underground, spreading and burning into the earth for thousands of years. We notice what breaks through the surface and may think that's all there is. We may focus on not getting burnt in the moment, even though we sense something larger and deeper below. But if we are serious about change, we have to wake up to the fact that there is more going on than gendered bushfires springing up in episodes of miscommunication, harassment, discrimination, violence, and all the other day-to-day occurrences that add up to life under patriarchy. If we're serious about this, we have got to dig, preferably with plenty of company and with a full appreciation of the fact that although we didn't start the fire, it belongs to us now. Most people feel threatened by feminism, especially its non-liberal aspects, because it raises questions that invite us to look more closely, not only at the world, but at the complex fullness of who we are in relation to it. Feminism is a window on the world and our connection to it, and it is a mirror reflecting what our lives are about. Above all, it is a powerful framework for making sense of what we are participating in, for digging beneath the surface of status quo ideology and what we take to be reality to discover the unarticulated terms on which we actually live our lives.
Thank you. Can you read the next one?
At the same time that feminism can frighten us or make us feel uncomfortable, it can also empower us by making sense of what's going on and what this has to do with us. Feminism embodies us an enduring truth that male privilege and women's oppression are real and problematic for all of us, and that not only can we understand what's happening, we must understand it if we are to be part of the solution and not just part of the problem.
Yes, thank you. What I've done here, I've actually drawn a patriarchal tree. And Emma, would you like to read the short sentence I put up there, please? And explaining how deep patriarchy is.
The power of patriarchy is also reflected in its ability to absorb the pressures of superficial change as a defense against deeper challenges. Like all social systems, patriarchy is difficult to change because it is complex and its roots run deep, just like the patriarchal tree you see below. We cannot avoid participating in patriarchy. It was handed to us the moment we came into the world.
Thank you. And what do you think about that statement? And so the deep rootedness that we've put in there as well. So the core principles is where the roots lay in the tree.
Yeah, well done, Ishmael. Yeah, because, and we've talked about this in the movement about culture, yes, and how all cultures are rooted in a patriarchal system.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter where you go in the world, that this is how people are from birth, as it says, come into the world and they are automatically born into a system which is patriarchal, male dominated, and both sides are affected negatively by that, both men and women.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So what is the core of feminism? equality. And that's the end of my study. I'll just stop that there. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about the study at all? If not, what we'll do, we'll have a prayer. Okay, we'll pray then. Dear Holy God, we thank you so much for the presentation that I presented today and the information that I understood, and also everybody else's participation, which is very important to me. And we thank you so much, Lord, for that we still have the privilege to meeting you being amongst us, as well as being with each other. So please continue to bless the rest of our day, and may we continue to keep it holy and always have you in our thoughts, Lord. For we give you thanks and praise in and through our beloved Saviour, always to your great honor and glory. Amen.